How do you build a high-performing culture? This is Culture Architects. Candid conversations with extraordinary leaders sharing their biggest successes, failures, and lessons learned on their culture journeys. Here's David J. Friedman.
You know, there's probably never been an industry or maybe even a sector that's more intentional about behaviors and structures, even culture, than perhaps education is. So today on the Culture Architects Show, we're taking our cue on these things and more from one of the leading private boys' schools in the country. Tyler Casertano has been an educator for nearly 2 decades. And in those years, he's worn just about every educator's hat you can think of, from being a volunteer teacher in Guatemala to curriculum design in Brooklyn to varsity coaching admissions at St. Albans School in Washington, D.C. Today, Tyler is the head of school at Haverford School, which is an all-boys college prep institution in Haverford, Pennsylvania. Since assuming leadership in 2021, he's operationalized the school's 24 core virtues, which I'm really excited to talk about. And he's done that through structure and consistent intentional reinforcement. You're going to see a lot of parallels to what we talk about in our fundamentals with what Tyler does at the school. So it's going to be really an interesting conversation. So I'm really looking forward to Tyler and his example at Haverford showing us what it looks like when values are distilled into culture and showing us how powerful intentionality can be, even outside of a business context. So Tyler, welcome to the Culture Architects Podcast.
Thank you, David. Honored and grateful to be here.
All right. So before we do anything else, I want to just get a little bit of background, and I always like to kind of get the history of how somebody got to where they are today. So how did you get into private school leadership? Like, give me the background. Where did that all come from?
Sure. I was actually raised on 2 school campuses in Connecticut and New York. Both of my parents were lifelong educators until a few years ago when they retired. And I was I was raised on boarding school campuses. And so I was incredibly fortunate to grow up surrounded by educators. After college, I went to work in corporate America to see what that was like. And I knew that I had an interest in working in education, but I didn't know if that was just born out of comfort and familiarity or whether it really was my calling. And after just a couple of days working on Wall Street, I realized that it very much was a calling for me. And I continued in that job for a little bit, and then was so fortunate to be given an opportunity to, as you said, teach, coach, advise at St. Albans School in Washington, D.C.
And so is St. Albans, is that a boarding school, or what's the right language? Is the opposite of a boarding school a day school? Is that what the language is?
It is. Yeah. So St. Albans is mostly a day school for boys in grades 4 through 12 in Northwest Washington, D.C. It does have a small dorm for boys in the upper school, in the high school. That's about 10% of that population.
And Haverford School is a day school, correct?
Yes, we have no borders.
So I'm curious about, you said that you grew up in boarding school campuses, and I would imagine that, I'm guessing at this, but that in a boarding school where you've got the boys 24/7, the opportunity to teach and develop young people might be more powerful than it is in a day school where they're with you for a certain number of hours and they go home into whatever their home environments were. So in your experience, how do you overcome, or let me just ask it this way. Am I right about that assumption? And if so, how do you in a day school try to overcome those challenges that you wouldn't have as much in a boarding school?
Yeah, that's a great question. I do think that boarding schools are immersive in a way that day schools are not. And all educators on some level are working in loco parentis. I think that is more so the case at a boarding school where you are the only adults in their lives for portions of the year. Whereas, as you said, at a day school, the students are coming and going. And I think for us at Haverford, one aspect of our program that would not exist were we to be a boarding school is our lower school. I don't know of any boarding schools that have pre-kindergartners and kindergartens and first graders. I think in Victorian England they had some schools like that, but that is moved out of most boarding schools now are just high schools, and some of them junior boarding schools have middle schools. And I think for us as a day school, it's really important that we do two things. One, that we have a close partnership with our families so that they understand the culture that we are aspiring to build at Haverford and the standards that we are setting for the boys, and how they can they can have a partnership with us to extend those standards at home, and also that we have an understanding of where the boys are coming to us from every day, to recognize the forces in their lives off campus that are impacting the way that they're showing up at school every day. And we have all sorts of systems in place to give us that insight, and also to sort of communication structures that we use to build that partnership with families.
And so give me a sense of, so Haverford School, in a given graduating class, how big would a typical graduating class be?
About 115, 110.
Got it. And so in a school like a day school like you have, or even in boarding schools, I'm imagining, again, I don't know this to be true, so feel free to correct me if I have a misconception about this, but my picture of that is that in order for people to afford to be able to send their children to a private school like Haverford, that you've got to be in the upper echelon of people's economic circumstances. And so if that's true, in a sense, the environment there is, this isn't the right word, but I can't think of a better word to use, but it's an almost artificial environment in the sense that it's not reflective of what the world is like in general. So how do you try to manage that so that the young boys learn that this isn't how the world is always, and give them a taste of what that, or how do you deal with that factor?
Yeah, it's another really good question. The world here that we create for the boys certainly is artificial in a number of ways. One of which is it's all boys.
Yeah,
we certainly have
right off the bat,
many female members of the faculty and staff, but all of the students are boys, and that's one aspect of the sort of artificiality, if that's a word, or the sort of artificial context. We are fortunate with our geography to sit in a location that both gives us access to students from the city of Philadelphia, as well as the suburbs around us, and even the kind of western suburbs out to places like Downingtown or Westchester. And so that we also have access to public transportation with a few different bus systems and train systems here. So we're fortunate that we draw from a large geographic radius, over 90 zip codes.
Wow.
And we have an endowment and a sort of a culture of philanthropy at Haverford that does allow us to provide a significant amount of financial aid, so that we are able to have a socioeconomic diversity here on campus that helps us represent the broader landscape of the city, but certainly that does not allow us completely to sort of represent the demographics of the entire city. So we try to take advantage of the resources that we have to, within the context of a boys' school, be as diverse as possible. And we also recognize that there are certain limitations in our ability to do that.
And so are there things or programs you do, activities you do to help students have a better understanding or appreciation of the world, what the world at large is like, so that they don't come out of school thinking, oh, this is how the world works?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things that we've tried to do more and more of here at Haverford is to provide the boys and the faculty with opportunities to share their experiences with one another, to take advantage of the rich diversity that we do have here on campus. And we can talk about some of the systems that we have that force the boys to make the most of that diversity here, to disabuse them of any perspectives that they might have about who their peers are, or the stories of their faculty leaders. We also have a service program that does try to get the boys into sort of corners of our city that maybe they have not experienced before. And then even beyond that, as they get older, we do have a global studies program that allows them to travel even beyond the confines of the city or country to experience the larger world in ways that are consistent with the perspectives and the awarenesses that we are trying to expose them to.
So let's talk about the 24 virtues at Haverford. Is that something that was created years ago, and where did that come from? Let's start there, and then I'm curious to learn more about how do you now, I'm going to use the word indoctrinate, and I don't mean that in a negative way, but indoctrinate the boys into these virtues.
Yeah. Well, they have been around for decades. I think sort of philosophically and practically, where they come from is an awareness that language is something that often does not come as naturally to boys as it does to girls. And so much of our lower school program is in middle school, but more so in the lower school, is helping build brains that can absorb the language that we think is going to be most beneficial to the boys' development. And that can be the language of literacy. Again, reading is something that boys often develop about a year behind girls, or whether it's the language of social and emotional learning, teaching the boys to have the vocabulary to understand what is happening, and then to regulate those aspects of their social and emotional experiences, and certainly the language of character and good behavior. And that's where the virtues are so beneficial to us. We have these words that aren't just words. They are the fundamental building blocks of character. And we have a program that in developmentally appropriate ways gives substance to those words in a way that hopefully allows them to incorporate them into their lives, both on campus and off campus. But we feel as though without literally carving them into stone on campus, having them be very visual to them, the boys are not necessarily going to have that innate understanding of the importance of those words and how to apply those words and the principles that they represent into their lives.
You know, you talk about the physical representation, people seeing those things. And I talk about that all the time. And our listeners know that there's an 8-step framework that I teach for how to intentionally build and create a culture or indoctrinate a culture into an organization. One of those 8 steps are the visual reminders. And they're not enough, of course, as you well know. But yes, the more I see that stuff around me, the more we're thinking about, the more we're talking about, it does matter, in my experience, to have physical representations. So give me an example of 2 or 3 of the virtues and how you go about teaching them and having people live them out in their daily lives.
Sure. We can start in the lower school just because I was talking about them before. The lower school actually has a pared down set of virtues just because, again, for those younger boys, their brains only have so much capacity for language. And so we really need to identify for them the 4 most important virtues, which are courage, honesty, respect, and friendship. And we have what we call banner boys, who are 5th graders, the oldest boys, who go through a process of applying for those positions. And And we have 4 banner boys that represent each one of those virtues. And one of the things that the banner boys do is they go to the community time, the sort of assemblies that we have for the lower school, and they will talk about the virtue that they represent. They will talk about how they think about that virtue, how that virtue has impacted them, ways in which maybe they've struggled to incorporate that virtue, ways in which they've been successful in incorporating that virtue. But for us, what we have found with boys is that boys need to feel strong. They need to feel successful. And so often the challenge there is that they don't want to put into practice the thing that they need the most practice at. They only want to do the things where they feel confident, where they feel strong. And we've sort of part and parcel, what we've found is that boys crave relationships. And that the relationship is actually more important than the rubric. That boys, they will do something if they feel as though the person who is empowering them or asking them or demanding that they do that really cares about them and sees them. They won't just do it because it's the right thing to do.
Interesting.
And that actually, if you tell a boy what to do and the boy doesn't actually believe that you care about him, sometimes he'll do the opposite just to sort of stick it to you. And so for us, it's really important that we build the relation, that we teach the boys to build healthy relationships with one another and with the faculty members, and that we have older boys that are representing these virtues or these aspects of our education that are really challenging, but in a way that is sort of grounded in vulnerability and in authenticity, so that the younger boys don't see those moments of quote unquote weakness as weakness, but actually as strength. And so we get older boys often to talk about failure, to talk about doubt, to talk about struggle, so that the younger boys are able to embrace those as just innate aspects of learning and growth and development. One of the sort of lines that we use with the younger boys all the time is, we can do hard things. And the sort of underlying principle is that to do the hard things, you need to embrace the discomfort. Things that again, so often boys see as weakness. And having those older boys have relationships with the younger boys and be able to model that vulnerability and that authenticity is so inspiring and enabling to the younger boys to lean into these things, where often we find that boys, they lean out because they don't want to be seen as being weak.
Yeah, that's fascinating. It reminds me, and I'm trying to think of where I read this, whether it was an interview. I can't even remember where it came from, but I remember talking to somebody or reading about an organization, or maybe it was a sports team, and what the author or writer was talking about is the importance of making it, I'm going to use the word cool, to do the right stuff, which is what I hear you saying, really, that, boys want to be cool. And if it's cool to be vulnerable and cool to be able to be authentic, then I'll do that. But if that's like, oh, you don't want to do that, that's what those other kids are like that. The cool kids don't do that, which is what typically happens in most groups of boys. But if you can make living with character be cool from a young age and something to look up to, now you've shifted the game a lot.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, boys are status-seeking beings. And if the status aligns with the virtues that we espouse, that's when we are at our very best. And so another thing that we do in the lower school to sort of chunk up the virtues is we'll have a virtue of the month. And older boys all have a younger buddy, third graders and kindergartners, fourth graders and first graders, fifth graders and second graders. And they get together at least once a month, and they will talk about the virtue of the month.
Wow.
And then the boys will write journal entries about the conversation that they had, about what they learned from their buddy, how they try to talk with their buddy. They'll do a drawing of it so that there's a visual representation of it. But so much of this, again, is to align sort of leadership, mentorship status with these aspect of not just the virtues, but also with those social and emotional skills that the research that we see shows boys often struggle with, especially in those earliest grades. They do not give themselves permission to develop the very skills that they as boys need so much from a relational and emotional and psychological standpoint.
Yeah, I can see that. So one of the things that in the things that I teach and the fundamental system that we teach people, most organizations will end up having somewhere between about 25 and 30 what we call fundamentals, behaviors. They would be similar to your virtues. And of course, the most common pushback I hear every single time without fail is, that's too many. People can't remember all that. And I help them understand, if we're only taking one at a time, it's fine and it works really well. And in fact, which of these would you leave out if you had to limit it to 3 or 4 or 5? I imagine you hear a similar kind of pushback, that when people hear 24 virtues, how could boys learn that? So how do you typically respond to that question when you get it?
It's a great question, and one that we have been talking about recently, whether we have too many virtues, whether some of them are redundant, whether all of them are actually virtues, or whether some of them are skills that can be done virtuously or can be done unvirtuously. We just went through a strategic visioning process that resulted in a new strategic vision last summer. And one of the things that will come out of that process is a revisitation of the virtues. One of the points that
whether you do that or not.
Yeah.
Okay.
One of the points that has been made about the breadth of the virtues, though, is that we as a school have boys aged 4 through 19. And there is just tremendous developmental range in that. And so there are some virtues that are digestible for a 4-year-old that are not necessarily the type of vocabulary that we want to use for a 19-year-old. And certainly there's a lot of vocabulary around character and behavior and virtue for 19-year-olds that we would never feel comfortable using for a 4-year-old. And so
yeah, that makes sense.
One of the benefits of having the range is that we can pick and choose in a way that captures the sentiment of what we are trying to accomplish, but with words that boys at that age are going to be able to internalize and then externalize in the ways that we want to. But yeah, now we certainly do hear that. Do we sort of have breadth over depth? And that's one of the reasons why in the lower school we have those 4 core virtues that are represented by the banner boys. We have a virtue of the month. We just created a house system where the boys are sorted into 4 different houses. Each house is named after a person in the Haverford story who's played an integral role in our success. The virtue that most aligns with their story and their leadership is the core virtue of that house. The houses are vertical through the grades, and there is there is grade level leadership within the houses. So really, it's about sort of chunking these virtues into digestible bites for the boys in a way that, as I said, allows them to be internalized as well as possible, and then externalized through their behavior.
Yeah. So in the upper school, where they can absorb these 24 virtues, what is the cycle for how you mentioned in the lower school where you only have 4, you take 1 a month? Is there 1 a month, 1 a week, or how do you cycle through them, or do you cycle through them in the upper school?
We do. The rising student body leadership will spend time with me and other senior leaders in the community over the summer before their senior year, what we call Form 6 year. And we will work together to choose a virtue of the year that is both an aspect of our culture that they and we feel like needs some to be spotlit, and that also is consistent with what they believe their class can really move forward for us. We want it to be something that they can speak to, that they can model, and that we as an upper school community would really benefit from. So we do have a virtue of the year, and that frames so many of the speeches that they'll give to the upper school over the course of the year. It'll frame some of the letters that I send to the full community. And we get a great deal of use from that highlighted virtue each year.
And so if you're highlighting that this year, how am I, if I were a boy in the upper school, how am I learning, observing, practicing the other 23 during that? Because I'm sure, obviously, you're not ignoring the other 23. So what's happening with the other 23 during that period?
Yeah, it's one of the things that we've tried to do the last couple of years is choose a virtue that does represent, as I said before, what their class is capable of leading forward for us, what we need, but also a virtue that we feel as though will amplify our ability to live the other virtues as fully as possible. So we've tried to move away from virtues that we feel like have value, but only sort of in isolation relative to that value, and instead to turn to virtues that we feel as though will better allow us to live the other virtues as fully as possible. Oh, sorry.
So can you give an example of that? So give me an example of what would be one that might be one for the year, and how that would allow you to practice other virtues.
Sure. So one year recently we had courage, and we talked about how courage in many ways is the foundation of all the other virtues, because to live those virtues as fully as possible, you can't simply live them when they're convenient or available or easy. That actually what matters most is living them when it's challenging, when there's a cost. And we spent a lot of time that year as a community talking about moments where we were choosing the hard right over the easy wrong, and we were seeing courage not as the absence of fear, but as the willingness to work through that fear to do what we knew to be right. Another year, the virtue was integrity, which we talked a lot about as alignment of the virtues. Not just alignment of the virtues and our ability to integrate all of them, but also our consistency as individuals and as the community in living those virtues in a variety of different spaces. That not just in these formal moments where we're together talking about leadership, but in those moments where nobody's watching. So that's where we will try to use a virtue that we feel like is sort of a springboard for discussions about virtue, broadly speaking, and other virtues that can only be done as well as possible if we're willing to embrace that virtue of the year.
I mean, something that you might consider as you think about it, going through your strategic planning, what we do with fundamentals is we take one every week, and we do a variety of things throughout the week to focus. This week, everybody's on number 1, and next week, everybody's on 2, and next week, number 3. And we just cycle through them over and over and over and over again forever, without necessarily highlighting one. Of course, we talk about all of them all the time, as one would guess, that, one of our fundamentals, as we call it, is called honor commitments. Do what you say you're going to do when you say you're going to do it. Well, if this week we're focusing on practicing blameless problem solving and an issue comes up around honoring commitments, of course we're talking about honoring commitments. So we're talking about them all the time, but we just have an elevated focus each week on one particular one. And the cyclical nature of going through them over and over and over and over again allows, in my experience, them to become internalized over time. And so we just put some structure to laying them out in that kind of way.
Yeah.
So I'm curious.
And I would, that's helpful and validating, because when we talk about the virtue of the year with the rising leaders of the upper school, it is a commitment. It is an agreement that this is going to be a true north for them that they're dedicated to for the year. And when we're giving them feedback, both positive and affirming feedback, but also critical feedback, that's the lens that we go through. That we said this was something that we were going to focus on over the course of the year. And kudos to us for living that in these moments. Or, we really need to remember that this is the bar that we've set, and maybe we're not living up to that. So I love the idea of sort of seeing those as commitments.
Yeah. Can you think of, I'm sure you can, give me an example of a time, it could have been this past year or maybe previously, where something happened, you don't have to give me names, but something happened and you had to lean into the virtues to make a very difficult decision. Maybe it was letting somebody go. Maybe it was something happened and it was the virtue that caused you to say, well, this is not the way we do things here, and had to make a tough decision by leaning into your virtues.
It's an interesting question where my mind sort of goes, and maybe this is just because I was a few minutes ago talking to the seventh grade boys about leadership. They're doing a unit right now on leadership, and they asked me to come and talk about my position and my experiences. And I asked them what they've learned through this mini unit. And then we kind of built on that. But one of the things that we talked about is the importance of having a mission, and a mission that does express your true north of who you are, and at a high level, what you are trying to accomplish. And what I said to the boys is, as a school that's pre-K through 12, and that has thousands of alums and hundreds of families, hundreds of boys, a few hundred faculty and staff, it is often the case that what a person is asking for is helpful to them, that it really would benefit them and their experience. But what we are constantly trying to do is to calibrate that with what is best for the community collectively, and how that intersects with our mission. And so one of the points that I made to him is, we're always going to be accused of certain things. That's just the nature of managing a community this large and diverse. The question is whether we are comfortable being accused of those things. And that's where my head goes to the virtues of when we are making decisions that we know are going to be unpopular. Do we believe that they're going to be unpopular for reasons that we consider to be virtuous? And this was the driving, in many ways, emphasis of that strategic visioning process. We did not go into that process by thinking about where are the areas of campus where we are deficient? Where are the areas where we can be better? We actually did the opposite. We said, when we are at our best, what does that look like? What does that feel like? What does that sound like? And what were the conditions that created that? And how can we build a mission, a vision, a set of priorities around that, so that we are that version of ourselves as consistently and fully as possible, so that hopefully it is a rising tide that lifts all boats. And there were so many moments in that conversation where we knew that there were trade-offs, but we were going to choose the trade-off that was most consistent with our true north, which was that mission and the virtues that are at the core of that. So I don't know that sort of fully answers your question with a specific moment where we either, as you said, had to make a discipline case or talk talk to faculty about some difficult decisions that we were making that maybe wouldn't be able to prioritize their program or provide them with the resources.
In a corporate
But I feel like
setting,
in some ways that's kind of every day. That's kind of every day for me.
Yeah.
And we just keep falling back on, when we're accused of something, is it something that we're comfortable being accused of? Because we've known that, well, it's not a decision that everybody is going to agree with. It is a decision that is consistent with our mission, our priorities, and the virtues that we are built on.
In a corporate setting, where that shows up most frequently is letting go of a person who maybe is a high performer in certain respects, but isn't living to the character and the virtues and the values and the culture that we've wanted to promote. And this person is opposite of that, but they're really valuable in the company in other ways. And when you have to make that decision to let them go, you're making a clear statement to the organization that, you know what, we're serious about this. That the fact that person sells a lot of business, that's nice, but we stand for things here, and it's not acceptable. And that's a loud, clear message to the whole organization that we're serious about it. This matters.
Yep. Yeah. So actually, as you say that, the thing that comes to mind as a piece of the execution of the strategic vision for the 26-27 school year, we've changed the extracurricular requirements that we are asking the boys to engage in outside of the classroom. And we've increased them in terms of volume, and we've broadened them in terms of the different types of engagement that they have to satisfy. So we are asking more of the boys outside of the classroom. And we're doing so for a couple reasons. One, we have a great deal of data that we've collected from the boys that shows that the healthiest, happiest, most successful students at Haverford are the most engaged students. They're the boys that do the most on this campus. We also have data that shows that relationships and engagement go hand in hand, that the more a boy does, the stronger his relationships are. And consequently, the stronger his relationships, as I said before, the more he will do. And we hear all the time a boy say, I took that class, not necessarily because I was so interested in it, but because I really love that teacher. Or a boy will say, I did that activity just because one of my friends said, hey, you should come do this. And lo and behold, it's one of the things that I've enjoyed most about Haverford. And this point too, this is directly related to our mission, which is transformation. Our job is not to educate boys so that they leave Haverford a little bit further along in their journey than they were before, or better at the things that they were already good at. For us, education means that every boy at Haverford leaves with a new understanding of who he is and what he is capable of doing. To do that, we have to ask him to do things that he doesn't know he can do, or he doesn't feel permission to do. And we have to create the conditions on campus that demand that incentivize that. And so for us, that meant that we had to dial up what we call that engagement requirement. We've gotten some pushback from people who say, this is going to work against my specific program because I'm now getting less of that boy. Before he was able to be with me for more time than he now will be able to. And to those people, we're saying, we understand there might be some aspect of that. But again, our job is not specifically to allow for the most successful experience within the silo of that program.
Right.
Our job is to provide a transformative experience for every boy. And doing that requires that we change his conception of who he is so that he's not just defining himself as being really talented in that one area, but he understands that he has a higher and broader ceiling than just that.
Yeah. So here's an interesting question, at least I think it is. I think about the world is changing so rapidly right now, more rapidly than obviously at any point in human history. Forget U.S. history, human history, and so what it takes, in some ways, what it takes for a young person to be able to thrive in some unknown world. I mean, we don't even know what the world is going to look like. 5 years from now, let alone 20 or 30 or 40 years from now. And so preparing boys to be able to thrive in an unknown future environment is challenging. And yet at the same time, I would posit that there are certain virtues, characteristics that are enduring, unchanging, that regardless of what's happening in the world, you still have to act with integrity, and you still have to have courage, and you still have to, do the other kinds of things. So there's some element of this that seems to be enduring, unchanging, and it doesn't matter what's happening in the world. And there's some aspects of it in which we need to prepare people to deal with a very different kind of world. How do you balance those, or how do you think about that in your strategic planning?
Sure. Well, I think we, a few ways. One, we acknowledge exactly what you just acknowledged, which is the world is growing increasingly complex at a pace that is greater than prior generations, and it is still rewarding a set of timeless virtues that that were being discussed in millennia of past. And being discussed in a way that seemed to transcend any one culture. So it transcends geography, and it transcends chronology. And one of the things that we say to our boys regularly is that character is more important than competency. That success is more about who you are than it is about what you can do. And while we hope that we'll be able to prepare them to have a high intersection of those two, they can never sacrifice their character for specific competency. And with the strategic vision, one of the other things that sort of we acknowledged is that, as you said before, we don't know what the boys will be asked to do in 5 years, 20 years, 30 years. We don't know what they will be asked to know in 5 years, 25 years, 30 years, 50 years. What we do know is that they're going to need to adapt and evolve. That more is going to be asked of them, not just in the workplace, but as men, broadly speaking, than was asked in prior generations. And so it's our job to equip them not just with those habits of character that we believe will be timeless, but also with the ability to learn and to grow. And part of that, as we said before, with the engagement requirement, is not allowing them to define themselves in these narrow, singular ways, but actually forcing them to redefine themselves in ways here that we believe the world is going to ask them to redefine themselves. So if we can equip them with that those habits of learning and growth, we believe they will be able to apply them in dynamic ways, regardless of what the world might be asking about them or asking them to do.
When you made the comment that, for millennia, we've been talking about the same kinds of virtues, and you think about Greek and Roman philosophers, and you think about, here we are in the hotbed of Philadelphia and coming up to the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And when you read about some of our founding fathers, it seems to me, I say this anecdotally, that it seems like when you read about them, so much of what they wrote and talked about was about character and virtue. They really weren't. I mean, they were amazing people, and shoot, Ben Franklin, how accomplished was he? But all of them were writing about virtue and about the things that mattered in their lives. And most of those things are as true today as they were 250 years ago as they were 2,000 years ago. It's part of being human.
Absolutely. And so, I would say that we sometimes talk about sort of a future-proof education. And we believe that the virtues are future proof, and that process of adaptive learning and adaptive growth is also future proof. We don't want to fill them with a set of static skills or a set of static understandings of themselves, but allow them to build that enduring base of character as defined by the virtues, but to apply it in these ways that will be as dynamic as the world that awaits them.
Yeah. So I think about, if I'm picturing the Haverford School, and you've got from pre-K all the way to 19-year-olds, and if I were to picture, I have this visual in my brain of, I'm picturing them, in a line. So here's my 5-year-old, 6-year-old, 7-year-olds, 8-year-olds, and so on. And I'm imagining that just based on the demographics of when people move into the area, what's going on in their lives, people enter into your world at different points. Some of them enter as a 5-year-old and spend 14 years with you. Some of them may enter as a, 9th grader and only have a few years with you. Where is there a typical, first of all, for where they enter the Haverford system, and then how do you adapt to treating them differently? I mean, if I've been with you since I was 5 and I'm now 18, that's very different than if I joined you when I was 16 and I'm now 18.
Yeah. We do have a variety of different entry points. The pre-K and K would be sort of the earliest and the main ones. And then after that, we sort of have a slow drip every year. And then the next kind of largest entry point would be 9th grade, high school.
Okay.
Exactly what you said is something that we talk about all the time of how do we build culture? How do we establish those expectations, those standards, those habits that right away we are asking boys to adhere to and build for boys both who have been here in some years for 12 years and some years boys and boys who've been here for 2 years. And one of the things that we know is most beneficial in that process is shared experiences, rituals that communicate to the boys day in, day out what those expectations are, or that just through their very nature demand a certain way of treating each other and treating this place that is consistent with the culture that we espouse to create. And so one of the pillars of our strategic vision is called Anchor. And that is about creating more shared experiences that both reinforce the very habits that we are trying to build, and that communicate to the boys those aspects of culture that are most important to the place. And these are not one-off experiences. These are just aspects of each day, each week, each month at Haverford that become so normalized that the boys don't even necessarily think about them. It's just a part of how you go through this place.
Yes. In the system, that in our fundamental system, the second of I mentioned these 8 steps. The first step is how we define what we want, which is in your case virtues, in my case fundamentals. And the second step, which is so foundational, we call it creating rituals. It's that when there are rituals about how we talk about this stuff, how we practice this, the habits that we do, and to your point, when they become second nature. It's just how you go to our school, you work in our company, it's just what we do around here. It's become so internalized that people can't even imagine not doing it. And my experience is that if you don't create those rituals, it doesn't ever last. It has to become second nature for people. And that only happens when it's part of our routines. It's just what we do around here.
Yep. And there's some emerging research about how important structure is for boys. That the sort of predictability, the consistency. What I've also found working now at two boys' schools, is that while boys are drawn to routine and tradition and structure, they also don't like it when it feels forced or contrived, which is all the more important that we build these shared experiences that feel very organic, that feel very natural, that they don't think to question, as you said. It's just part of what we do.
You think about the popularity of James Clear's Atomic Habits, and it's really the same thing. It's when we have habits for how we do things, it's just what we do. It's not hard. It's not it's just what we do, and hard to be successful without developing those kinds of habits. So I'm curious about you've worked in two boys' schools. Is it typically the case? I'm guessing it probably is, but is it typically the case that in most private day schools or boarding schools that character, it may be done in different ways, but that character is an important element in what is being taught and what draws people to those kinds of schools? Or is that more unusual for Haverford or perhaps St. Albans?
I think every independent school that I know of does have a core set of values or virtues. They use different language to describe them, but there is a guiding set of principles that do speak to the highest value of that education, and that many schools use to separate between instruction and education. So I don't think that we are altogether different in having a set of core virtues. I do think that I can't necessarily speak to other independent schools, but we are very intentional in how we weave them into the culture and into the program so that they aren't just words that are on the wall, but we think about how those virtues are represented in the reading lists that we ask our boys to engage with through the English program or through the service learning program that we have or through our athletic program, and the specific aspects of our program that are delivered best through the fields and the pool and the courts or through the performing arts program. So I do think that it's very important for us not to just give lip service to the virtues, but to make sure that they are embedded in the program in very specific and intentional ways.
Yeah, makes sense. And so do you think, are most independent schools single-sex schools? Is that typical or more of them co-ed?
No, the vast majority are co-ed.
Oh, interesting. And so what do you think is the biggest difference in how, if you were the head of a co-ed school versus the head of a all-boys school, what would be the biggest thing you would do differently, do you think?
I think, having grown up on co-ed schools, at co-ed schools, gone to co-ed schools, I have a daughter who goes to an all-girls school, a son who goes to Haverford. I've worked here. I don't necessarily think that at the highest level, boys' schools, girls' schools, co-ed schools are trying to accomplish fundamentally different things. I think we all, by and large, want our students to grow into the fullest version of themselves, to be the best possible version of themselves that they can be. I do think that boys' schools and girls' schools feel as though tactically they have opportunities to accomplish that through being single-sex environments. And at a girls' school, what that often looks like is they feel that with boys not on campus claiming spaces, that girls have access to those spaces, that they're not being crowded out. It might be leadership, it might be athletics, it might be math, science. They feel as though girls have access to those areas without boys to claim them. We say the same thing as a boys' school, just about an equal and opposite set of spaces. That without girls present to define certain spaces as effeminate or female, that the boys will give themselves license to move into them. Or kind of said differently, that without girls on campus to play certain roles, boys have to play all roles on campus.
That makes a lot of sense.
And that allows themselves to develop as fully as possible, as opposed to, for me at a co-ed school, I felt as though there were lanes that I was asked to exist in. And that meant that I was only developing certain aspects of myself in school, and that I needed to go outside of school to become the fullest version of myself. So that's where we really feel as though, one, our expertise on the way that a boy's brain is developing, especially at those youngest grades, really in lower school and middle school, the awareness of a boy's cognitive development and how we can make sure our program is developing that boy's brain as fully as possible, and our awareness of a boy's conception of what it means to be a boy, and how so often that limits the ways in which he is engaging at school. And if we can get those two conditions right, then we will develop a boy as fully as possible so that he can become the fullest version of himself.
When you talk about becoming the fullest version of yourself or of anybody's self, there's a lot of writing these days about the importance of people at all ages, but especially young people, discovering for themselves kind of their gifts, their interests, their passions. What is it, instead of me learning, a set of things that I've been told that I have to learn, how do I discover for myself what makes me uniquely me so that I can become a fuller version of myself? And so it seems like maybe I'm just drawn to those kinds of writings lately, but it feels to me like there's more out there about that thought in education than perhaps there used to be. And if I'm right about that, I'm curious about how do you help students, young boys, to learn what's unique about me? That if I'm going to be the fullest version of myself, the fullest version of me may be different than the fullest version of you. And how do I discover me in that?
Yeah. Well, I think at the youngest grades, it starts with developing a program that allows boys to be successful at school. There's more and more research that shows that because boys develop at different rates than girls, often in co-ed settings, they don't feel as though they can be successful, and they start to associate negative feelings with school, which gets back to this idea that boys need to feel strong. If they can't feel that they can be successful, they will retreat. And so we want to have a lower school program that positions boys to be successful and to feel successful, to feel again, never to associate some of these negative emotions with weakness, but rather to understand that those negative emotions are simply part of what it means to be human. And there are ways for them to articulate them and to work through them to become the best version of themselves. I think it also requires that we do have a program that, as I said before, both forces and encourages or incentivizes them to engage broadly in ways that are not necessarily consistent with their perceptions of who they are or who they should be. So an example of this here at Haverford is we have a very strong performing arts program. And that starts in the lower school with the music program, the drama program, and actually the humanities program, which always entails a play or a skit or a public performance of some sort. And then in the middle school, we force the boys to take an acting class, a music class. And then there's the middle school musical, which has now become one of the most competitive groups to get into. And then in the upper school, we have a very strong performing arts program where through a few different ways, it has really become cool to be in the play and cool to be in the musical. And some of the boys who sort of conventionally you would least expect to be in the musical are in the musical. Boys who are off to are going to be competitive athletes in college, or who are members of our state champion robotics team. Those are the boys that are on stage. So this is an area where at a lot of co-ed schools, boys tend to associate with the girls, and therefore they don't feel comfortable engaging in those ways because they don't want there to be a judgment on them. Whereas at Haverford, that is available to them, and they've been taught through the program at an early age to make it available, and the culture encourages them to engage with it. And so for us, that's sort of an example of that. You all call yourselves the culture architects. We need to build the architecture to create the culture that is going to, in some ways, demand and in some ways encourage the boys to do these things that will help them understand that who they are and what they can do is not necessarily what they came into the school thinking. I would also say, part and parcel, we talk to the boys a lot about relationships, and there's emerging research that shows that boys and men crave relationships. We need relationships, and yet all too often we don't develop the foundational skills to build and maintain healthy relationships. And we talk to the boys a lot about how happiness and meaning and purpose and passion, first and foremost, comes from relationships. And that relationships can be really hard. And we tell the boys sometimes to remember that the root word of that passion is suffering. And so the thing that you're passionate about is the thing that you need to be willing to suffer for. And the way to limit that suffering is to have those relationships. That we don't believe that sort of hard work and joy are incompatible. We believe that they can and should exist together, but the number one condition to them existing together is relationships, or this set of relationships.
Right. Fascinating. So this has been a really interesting conversation, and I see so strongly the parallels between what you're doing and what we teach in terms of being culture architects. So I'm going to ask you one last question. This is probably an unfair question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. If you had to pick one of the 24 virtues that you would say maybe you're the senior and it's your class, and you had to pick one that you think, if I could only choose one to focus on more heavily than any other one, given everything you know about development of boys, which virtue would you pick?
I would pick courage. I mean, I've found that the thing that stands between a boy and his current state and who he wants to be is courage. That it's scary for these boys to do the things that we are asking them to do, that they often feel that they have been taught to believe is not what a boy should do. It's scary for them to hold one another accountable, which is something that we talk to them about constantly. It's scary for them to learn to embrace their the areas of their development where they're not strong and where they need to practice, which is why we believe the relationship between the boys and the relationship between the boy and the teacher is what defines the relationship between the boy and the program. And if we get those human relationships right, we'll get the programmatic relationship right, because it's those human relationships that give that boy the courage to do the thing that he doesn't think he can do, or to be the version of himself that he doesn't think he can be. And so for us, if there was one that really is the fundamental sort of ingredient to the special sauce, it would be courage.
Very cool. Well, Tyler, thank you. This has been such a fascinating conversation. I really appreciate you joining us. Again, I see so many parallels between what you're doing in a school environment, what we do in the corporate environment. It is all about what are the virtues, characteristics, values, fundamentals, whatever language you want to give to it. But these are the building blocks of what it means to be, healthy, fulfilled human beings in any environment. And to hear how you're doing that at the youngest of ages, certainly a heck of a lot better if somebody learned this stuff when they were 4, 5, 6, and 7 than if they were 35, 36, or 40. And so thank you for the work that you're doing and helping to I'm going to use the word indoctrinate, but I mean that in a good way, to indoctrinate young people into the virtues that will help them to live more fulfilling lives.
Well, thank you, David. It was such a pleasure to be here. I'm grateful to have the opportunity to learn from you all and to contribute to the conversation by sharing a little bit about who we are at Haverford and the work that we're trying to do with boys.
Thank you so much.
Take care.
And that wraps up today's episode of Culture Architects. If you're enjoying these conversations, subscribe on your favorite platform and also consider leaving a quick review, and that way other culture-minded leaders can find the show. And for more tools on building a high-performing culture in your organization, visit CultureWise.com. See you next time on Culture Architects.
This has been Culture Architects with David J. Friedman. Join us next time for more insights and wisdom from great leaders in all walks of life. To book David for your next event or to learn more about his writing, speaking, or consulting, go to davidjfriedman.com. Culture Architects with David J. Friedman is a production of CultureWise.